anything, so the premise of the Four Noble Truths is that we're born into suffering and we have to acknowledge it in order to move forward. Is there anything about this cultivation of compassion and love that can address that specifically to undo the premise that we're always going to be born into suffering and dealing with a lifetime of suffering?
I think
not
this
about
is a
suffering. That's the whole thing. For Pope Benedict, he was very, and even for John Paul before, the Paul before, or whatever. Which one was it before Benedict? I forgot. Oh, what happened? You okay?
Yeah, I'm okay. I'll be right back.
Oh, and he was so worried in The Threshold of Hope, the 2 popes ago, he wrote a book, but that book was written by Benedict when he was Ratzinger, who was the Grand Inquisitor at that time, the head of the Office of the Doctrine of the Faith, which is the Inquisition, and what's, left of the Inquisition. And he wrote, how can anybody be a Buddhist? They must be so miserable, all of them, sitting there in the suffering, and that's all they got is suffering. And look at us here in Rome. We're jolly and happy. We have red Gucci loafers. No, never mind. It's like a joke. But the point is, that's a mistake. Buddha's discovery is the third noble fact, you could even call it, or truth, or reality. And that is nirvana, which is the freedom from suffering.
Right.
It's not the destruction or the end of life, it's the end of suffering. And that's why people like Buddhism. Asian people like to have fun too. So they're not going to get into, oh, let's all suffer. And then as the Dalai Lama says, the only reason the first noble fact, or fact for a more compassionate person, even the definition of noble had to do with compassion, actually, why he calls it noble. The first one is just if you went out and promoted the first noble fact without having discovered the third one, you'd be like someone who is going to someone whose life imprisoned and has no way of parole and going, nya, you'll never get out. And what would be the point of that? Right. The reason that he said the unenlightened life will be frustrating and inadequate and unsatisfactory and will be ultimate. Even the temporary pleasure or relief is suffering in the sense that it doesn't last. And it ends in death and sickness and old age and all this. And so that's only to spur people to find out that they're capable of terminating suffering by attaining nirvana. In other words, freedom from suffering, which is not that hard to attain for a human being, and according to the Buddha. So that's why he launched this huge educational process throughout the world. So the third noble truth. So the Pope, I through the press, I kind of tried to reassure Cardinal Ratzinger not to worry. That it wasn't that Buddhists were pretty jolly, actually, because they looked forward to an end of suffering, in fact. And part of achieving that end of suffering is acknowledging that as long as I'm a selfish jerk, I'm going to have a hard time. Even I become president of the United States, or I live in a triplex. If I'm going to just be out for me, then everybody else is going to hate my guts. Right? That's sort of the lesson.
Yeah. And the science is helping us reach more people with this.
Yes, very much so. Yeah. Because why? The inner science is looking at the reality of life. That's what Buddha's thing was. It wasn't what believed something that's sort of unrealistic. It was looking at the reality of life. And we humans are very entangled with each other, and therefore, without compassion, we're doomed. We will not remain in the human life form.
And I would say that the scientific findings that we review are all in accord with and align with what the classical texts say.
Yes.
Are the changes that people go through.
I think so. Although, the problem with the scientists, there's a wonderful NYU, and your college, Thomas Nagel, great philosopher you have down the street here at NYU. He recently wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos, which I love. I love his earlier books too. And in that book, he says that the attempt to explain the nature of life, particularly after the biologists, by trying to reduce everything to some materialistic processes, is doomed to failure. And he makes a very sort of limited but very strong philosophical set of arguments that kind of show that. But they're kind of stuck with that. And he said the reason they're so stuck with it is they think if they open up to a mind, which he notes very perspicaciously, they all have one. Every scientist has a mind, I hope. And he says if they do, they're afraid it will come back to sort of theism, and they'll be burned at the stake like Giordano Bruno, or they'll be like Galileo and silence, and they won't get tenure and they won't get research funding. So they're very frightened to give up on this sort of dogmatic materialism, rather than, and then Nagel says he's sure there is a way in which the mind can be brought back into nature and be an object of scientific study without sacrificing sort of practicality and specificity and phenomenology or blah, blah, whatever you want to call it. And that's what they have to discover. And actually, that's the Buddhist inner science. So how the mind shapes life, and along with all physical things, you know.